February 2nd, 2009. Albuquerque, New Mexico. When going on your typical morning or afternoon stroll, there might be many things that you might come across that might not strike you as out of the ordinary. However, on one fateful day, Christine Ross would take her dog Ruka out for a walk, and she unknowingly would stumble upon the workings of a true monster. That fateful day would send the Albuquerque Police Department on a hunt for a serial killer. A serial killer that to this day has not been caught and claimed the lives of 11 sex workers, all from the Albuquerque area. Who was this killer who carelessly disposed of his victims in these makeshift graves in the middle of West Mesa? What do we know about the victims, and is there any evidence today that could lead us to solving this 15-year-old cold case and the largest unsolved homicide in New Mexico history? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we venture back into the true crime realm and discuss yet another monster that could still walk among us. A monster dubbed the West Mesa Bone Collector. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today's topic is back into the realm of true crime. And I knew I had to kind of go back into true crime relatively soon, as I knew it had been a couple weeks since I had done a true crime episode. I feel like I try and change it up as much as I can week to week, so I knew that I had to pick true crime and go back to it eventually. So, in my research into the world of true crime, I stumbled upon this case. And of course, I am always attracted to the stories that are unsolved and ones that are pretty high profile that many people haven't heard about. Quite frankly, I hadn't even heard about this case until I started doing some digging into it. Now, this case isn't all that old with it happening in 2009, but I will get deep into the story and when the actual supposed killings took place. Now, when doing my research, there is a couple names that this killer has been given with this case, and sometimes this case in broad scope is just referred to as the West Mesa murders. However, the name that has gained the most notoriety is the name that I chose of the episode, and that being the West Mesa Bone Collector. Now, the name West Mesa Bone Collector was basically anointed by the media, so if you look at the city of Albuquerque's basically information about the case, they will just label this as the West Mesa murders. They won't say West Mesa Bone Collector, mostly because, again, that was given by the media. Why they chose that name, I am not sure. But if you are doing your own research into this, some sources might have different names for it, so just keep that in mind before you kind of dive into this case yourself. Now, with that being said, how today's episode is going to work is that first we are going to go into the story of the Bone Collector and all of the victims the killer had, and then into some more facts and information I found during my research, as well as go over some prime suspects authorities believe could be responsible. And of course, at the very end, wrap it all up with my own personal thoughts, comments, and theories on the case. Now, that being said, let's get into the story and the origin of the West Mesa Bone Collector. Now, before we do that, let's set the scene in which these crimes would take place. The West Mesa area of Albuquerque is over 10,000 acres long and sits west of the city center, and has, within these 10,000 acres, sits a variety of geographical marvels. Not only is this area a sprawling desert grassland, but it also contains 3 different canyons, all containing ancient petroglyphs, the remains of 5 dormant volcanoes that were, of course, once active in this region, as well as numerous state parks and protected areas. So you would assume that this would be the perfect area if you're trying to get away from all the prying eyes from within the city. Now, we start on February 2nd, 2009. Christine Ross decided to go on her usual nighttime stroll with her dog Ruka. As Ruka was off-leash, he would often sniff around the surrounding area, and this night, of course, was no different. Now, when Ruka was sniffing around, he started digging and clawing at the ground, as he had found something protruding from the earth next to this kind of dry, arid piece of undeveloped land near some abandoned housing developments right on the edge of the West Mesa. Where this would be is right in between kind of the intersection of Dennis Chavez Boulevard and 118th Street. Now, just a little knowledge nugget. The killer is also sometimes referred to as the 118th Street Killer. Again, just a little factoid in case you decide to do your own research. Now, it turns out that during the housing market crisis in 2008, This area of undeveloped houses sat vacant and unfinished. Because of the construction, nearby residents of the housing development complained of frequent flooding due to storms, and the area being so kind of flattened out and basically ready for construction. Now, that caused the builders of the property to build a runoff retention pond and wall to keep the water out of the neighborhood. Now, it is believed that because of this, and the pond being built in close proximity to where the bodies would be buried, that this water flowing would gradually erode the surface of the soil, and this is what would cause this object, which we later find out to be a bone, would protrude from the earth from the get-go. Now, just in retrospect, now perhaps if that pond never got built, we still wouldn't have discovered the bodies to this day. However, of course, that is in hindsight. Now, when Ruka dug up this object, it turned out to be a bone, of course. And at first glance, Christine kind of didn't think too much of it. Ruka had dug up animal remains before. I mean, granted, Ruka is a dog. Of course, dogs are going to dig up bones and all sorts of things out of the ground, so Christine kind of naturally just kind of brushed it off. But as she looked closer at this bone, she got a very odd feeling about it, and something didn't fully sit right with her. The bone didn't look like a typical animal bone that she had seen before, and not fully sure what she was looking at, Christine snapped a picture of the bone and sent it along to her sister, who was a registered nurse. Now, Christine's sister saw the picture of the bone and said that it bared a striking resemblance to a human femur bone, which, in case you don't know what the femur bone is, that is in the leg. Now, taking this info from her sister, Christine immediately contacted the Albuquerque Police Department. Now, when the Albuquerque Police Department arrived, they agreed with Christine's sister's assessment of the femur bone and immediately launched an investigation on the area. Investigators descended on the site, and they started excavating around the small area in which the bone was found, and ended up making a horrifying discovery. In addition to discovering the first body in which the femur came from, was a second body buried in the same shallow grave. Now, because of the discovery of this second body, this ended up causing the police to widen their search area. In doing so, a discovery of a third body, and then a fourth. And over the course of the following months, the total body count would rise to 11 total bodies, all buried in this same plot of land. Now, the discovery of these bodies was intense, as they were spread out over this 92-acre plot of land at the end of 118th Street. Needless to say, this was quite the undertaking. Upon the discovery of the bodies, one thing was clear. They had been in the ground for quite some time, as all the bodies discovered were just bones. Now, as we will get into the victims here in a second, but after doing the math and the DNA evidence into all of these victims, it was clear that they were all killed in between 2001 to 2005, meaning that these victims could have been in the ground for numerous years, and this would explain their advanced state of decomposition and them basically just being bones at this point. Over the course of the next couple of years, the information regarding the victims would slowly be released to the public, as many were only identified through their dental records. Now, with that being said, let's get into the confirmed victims of the West Mesa bone collector. Now, these of course are in no particular order, but the first and second victims would be identified as Jamie Borella and Evelyn Salazar. Jamie, 15, and Evelyn, 27, would both be last seen attending a family gathering in April of 2004 near the Albuquerque airport. They would both be at the party for a couple hours before both leaving together. They would not be seen or heard from again by anyone after this. A week later, they were both reported missing. Now, an interesting tidbit to note as we dive deeper into the story, there seems to be an MO that the killer is following, so please kind of keep that in mind. Now, Evelyn, the older of the two, had been linked to drug use and sex work in the past. However, she was getting away from that and had been making progress in her life to get away from pretty much both of those things. She was trying to leave her past behind, which is completely understandable. Now, the idea of victims being former or current sex workers appears frequently throughout this case, so kind of keep that in mind as we continue through. Jamie was, of course, 15, and to my knowledge and my research, was not involved in any of Evelyn's drug use or sex work from Evelyn or sex work herself. Now, both women were last seen at a park at San Mateo Boulevard. The next victim would be 16-year-old Sylvania Edwards. She was originally from Lawton, Oklahoma, and had spent numerous years of her young life at a group home in Oklahoma for children of abuse and neglect. Her mother, father, and brother all went to prison, and that left her with very few family members to turn to. Now, at some unknown point in 2003, she ran away from that group home, and local authorities classified her as an endangered runaway. Now, Edwards wouldn't be seen again until May of 2004, when she was seen associating with prostitutes in Aurora, Colorado. Now, Edwards was arrested for solicitation, but was ultimately released. Now, it is unknown how she made it to New Mexico. However, it is assumed that she continued sex work once she made it to New Mexico. She might have been using the nicknames Mimi or Chocolate as her, basically, pseudonyms. It is believed that she was killed sometime between 2004 and 2005, and Edwards was the only African-American victim that we know of the West Mesa bone collector. The next victim would be Gina Michelle Valdez, who was presumed to be killed between 2004 and 2005 as well. At the time of her disappearance, she was 4 months pregnant. Now, Valdez already had 2 children at the time of her disappearance, and when she initially vanished, it took her father 5 months to report her missing. Valdez was also involved in sex work as well, and at the time of her body's discovery, the skeletal remains of the unborn child were also present. The next victim would be Monica Candelaria, and she would be last seen on May 15th, 2003. Now, she was 22 years old at the time of her disappearance, and Monica was officially reported missing from her family 2 weeks after her disappearance, and her family desperately tried searching for her, which they ended up having no luck. Now, much like the other victims, Monica was also involved in sex work, and was arrested for solicitation as well. Monica had connections to the gangs in Albuquerque, and had a long history of substance abuse. Her family at the time was convinced that she didn't just run away from her life, and it turns out they were right. She didn't run away, but instead was murdered and buried with the 10 other victims. The next victim would be identified as 24-year-old Virginia Clevin, who was identified through DNA evidence rather than her dental records. Virginia also had her fair share of troubles in life when at a young age her brother was murdered. This sent her life and mental health on a presumed downward spiral, as she would run away from home when she was a teenager. By the time Virginia was 17, she was addicted to drugs, and the only way she paid for those drugs was through sex work. She did not have much contact with her family, however, but what we do know is that on April 13th, 2004, she would make a phone call to her father stating that she was going to be getting married to a man who just got out of prison. Now, that would be the last time anyone had heard from Virginia, and it took a staggering 6 months for anyone to report Virginia as officially missing. The next victim would be confirmed to be 24-year-old Julie Nieto. Now, Julie also had a troubled past, and was a mother of 1. She would often leave her son with her mother, and she would be reported missing in July of 2004, a day after visiting her grandfather. Now, very little additional information is known about Julie, and I kind of couldn't find any other information out there about her to list in this section. Now, the next victim would be 26-year-old Victoria Chavez, who was last seen on June 5th, 2003. Now, you might be noticing a pattern when these people get reported missing, and that's a trend I will address here in a little bit. However, it took over a year before Victoria was reported missing by her mother. Now, Victoria frequented sex work as well, as she had been arrested for solicitation 5 times before her disappearance and was a known and frequent drug user. Now, it is unclear when Victoria might have been killed, but it has been assumed that she could have been long dead when her mother reported her missing a year after her disappearance. The next victim would be 28-year-old Veronica Romero. Now, Veronica was a mother of 5 children and was initially reported missing February 14th, 2004, after nobody seeing or hearing from her for 2 weeks. Now, Veronica was last seen getting into a white pickup truck in downtown Albuquerque. Her family and friends tried getting the community involved with search parties, and they ultimately did not find her. They tried doing volunteer search parties as well, and even hung posters throughout the city. Now, Veronica's family was pretty outspoken about the way the case was being handled by the Albuquerque Police Department, and the lack of effort from the police department to try and locate Veronica. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, as it will kind of come up here at the end when we kind of talk about the lack of effort on behalf of the police department. And I feel like in a lot of cases of whether it be missing people or unsolved cold cases, that there is almost kind of a dragging of the feet from the police department, and that really is what keeps these cases unsolved, is because just the lack of effort. But again, keep that in mind. I will circle back to it. I won't go in extensive detail right now, but just kind of keep that right in the back of your mind. The next victim would be 24-year-old Doreen Marquez, who was last seen on October 10th, 2003. Initially, Doreen had a good life with her 2 kids and her partner. However, her partner would be sent to prison, leaving her to raise her 2 kids by herself. Because of this added amounts of stress, Doreen would turn to drugs and often disappear for days on end until one of these days she wouldn't be seen from again. She had dropped her kids off at school that morning and would then disappear. Her family wouldn't report her missing until almost a year later, stating that because of her recent bout of disappearing, they thought this time would be no different, and that she would eventually show back up. However, she wouldn't. The last victim would be 32-year-old Cinnamon Elks, and she would last be seen in August of 2004. She was also a mother to a couple of children, but according to her mother, something happened when she was younger that steered her down the wrong path in life, as she quickly got tangled up in sex work and a drug habit. Because of this, Cinnamon would transfer custody of her 2 kids to her mother, Diana. She had been arrested a whopping 19 times for solicitation and 12 times for drug possession. She would be reported missing a month after not calling her mother on her birthday, which, according to her mother, is a date she wouldn't have missed, no matter the circumstances. However, the Albuquerque Police Department did not feel the same way, as they felt like she had pulled some type of disappearing act, and also did very little to try and discover Cinnamon's whereabouts. Now, that is all the victims that were discovered in the West Mesa area around 118th Street. However, there are a lot more similarities in the victims that I think is important that we touch on those as well. Now, the victims were all female, ranging from 15 to 32 years of age. Most of the women were involved with sex work or had a drug problem. Most, if not all, with the exception of Sylvania Edwards, were women local to the Albuquerque area. And a majority of them were also mothers. Now, that part of them being mothers could just be a coincidence, but I feel like it's worth noting. Now, another similarity in these cases is that many of them took a long time for these women to be reported missing, and I think there was a glaring reason why that is the case, and that was most likely due to family ties. A lot of the women who were tangled up in sex work and drugs took longer to get reported missing, most likely because they were not so close with their immediate family, and with the couple women who did have family that reported them missing right away, it seemed like the police weren't too eager to investigate their cases, and let me tell you why I think that's the case. Again, this is of course me just speculating, but because of women like Veronica and Cinnamon, who had families search and be very active members of leading the search, the police must have knew these women's professions, and or possibly they're dabbling in the world of drugs, so they weren't too eager to investigate, because they weren't so great members of society. Again, I'm not condoning the behavior from the police department here, as I have seen time and time again, and anyone who investigates cold cases or missing persons cases, the ones that go the longest being unsolved, often have ties with law enforcement, as I mentioned before, either just dragging their feet or not doing everything they can to try and solve the case. Now, with the police knowing these women's backgrounds, they probably said and considered that they wouldn't spend too much time searching, as they probably disappeared from time to begin with. Again, this is just my personal opinion, and that doesn't reflect anything against the Albuquerque Police Department, but currently I am just speculating. But I would not be shocked if that in fact was the case. Again, that is just my opinion. However, the Albuquerque Police Department chief of police came out after the bodies were discovered and said that solving the case was a top priority, and that they weren't fully convinced that this was the work of a serial killer, but rather shifted the blame and repeatedly mentioned the victims' ties to sex work in their quote-unquote high-risk lifestyle, which of course alludes to this idea that solving the case was kind of also on the back burner because of those victims who were in life and kind of like their just decision making, and just because they were sex workers or into drugs, that it was kind of like, oh, they had a high risk lifestyle, like this was probably going to happen. That's the biggest load of shit I've frankly ever heard. I feel like if somebody is missing, regardless of their background, you as the police department need to do your jobs and figure out what happened. Don't give me this high risk lifestyle bullshit. You need to do what you need to do to figure out where these people went. That is your job. You should not be dragging feet. You shouldn't be hesitating. There shouldn't be anything in regards there. You should be right on it and covering every lead you possibly can, rather than shifting the blame on their personal decisions. Now, I'm going to kind of shift a little bit, and another thing worth noting about the state of decomposition on the bodies. And it turns out that all of the bodies were stripped of clothing and personal items, including jewelry. Now, not only that, but the killer tightly wrapped all of the bodies in plastic, and due to the extreme heat of the New Mexico desert, this actually accelerated the decomp process, and it would make it 10 times harder to possibly find any forensic evidence left behind, if in fact there was any to begin with. Now, after all the bodies were identified in the West Mesa area, it was time to try and track down leads in regards to the case, and which, to be honest, there wasn't a lot. Approximately 2 years later, the Albuquerque Police Department would release images of 7 other victims that they said could be connected to the West Mesa bone collector, but had no way of proving it, and were basically looking for anybody who recognized these women to come forward and make a statement. Now, needless to say, with the bodies in the West Mesa being just skeletons, it left virtually no evidence to how these women died, or any DNA evidence that could have been left behind by the killer. So because of that, the police haven't even named any actual suspects, rather just strong candidates of interest. Now, with that being said, let's dive into some of the strong candidates of interest, and let's see which one could quite possibly fit the bill the best. Now, the first strong candidate is a man by the name of Joseph Blea. Needless to say, Joseph was not a nice person, nor an outstanding individual of the Albuquerque community. Joseph Blea was a frequenter of the area in which the sex workers of the city often resided, and he had a long history of run-ins with the police with this related activity, and also drug-related crimes. Now, Blea had reportedly had roughly 130 to 140 interactions with law enforcement over a 20-year period before the discovery of the bodies in West Mesa. One police report details an event where Blea exposed himself to a sex worker, and when the police were finally able to catch him after doing this, electrical tape and rope were found in the front seat of his vehicle. Now, it is unknown whether or not Blea was intending on using that electrical tape and rope on someone. However, it is very suspicious. Now, a week after the bodies were found, Joseph's first wife had actually called the police and said that he should be investigated. He was then trailed by police for numerous days, and his house was searched. However, no evidence has been released by authorities connecting him to the killings. Now, Joseph Blea also had a history of hiring sex workers and then tying them up against their will and physically assaulting them. In addition to this, his first wife also stated a discovery of women's underwear and jewelry stashed away in their shed. And this, of course, is significant, as I had mentioned before, with the victims not being buried with any of their clothes or personal items such as jewelry. However, Joseph Blea is currently behind bars for 90 years in connection with a string of sexual assaults in the 1980s, where he would break into the homes of young middle school-age teenagers and assault them. Now, after being put in jail in 2015, he confessed to a cellmate that he had previously hired the victims of the West Mesa bone collector, but has denied any involvement in the killings up to present day. Now, the only evidence that could be used against Joseph Blea in the killings was a tree tag that was on a tree discovered near the mass graves that was from a nursery that Joseph was known to frequent. However, of course, that is the farthest thing from a smoking gun. The only piece of evidence you have is that there happens to be a tree that came from this nursery where the guy kind of went to. That's not really evidence. That's kind of coincidence at that point, but at least that's my own personal opinion. Now, our second suspect of interest was a man named Lorenzo Montoya. Lorenzo also had a long history of violence towards sex workers, as in 1999 he was arrested for strangling a sex worker, and 5 years later he was arrested for a very similar crime. Now, Lorenzo was also accused of domestic violence numerous times. Much like Blea, he was not a nice person to be around, clearly. However, Lorenzo would not live to see when the bodies were finally unearthed in 2009. Lorenzo lived only approximately 3 miles away from the burial site in West Mesa, and in 2006 he had hired a sex worker and brought her back to his trailer. Lorenzo had no intention of paying up, and when confronted by the sex worker, he strangled her and killed her. When the sex worker's pimp came looking for her, he discovered that Lorenzo had her body wrapped together with duct tape and was loading her into his pickup. The pimp then shot and killed Lorenzo on the spot, knowing that he had killed the sex worker. The pimp never faced any charges for the killing of Lorenzo, and the murders seemingly stopped after that. Or the missing sex workers, that is. Now, keep in mind, this is 2006, so the timeline kind of fits. And what remains uncertain is, in fact, if there are more bodies buried somewhere from the bone collector. If, in fact, Lorenzo was the bone collector, it would be reasonable to assume that he used the West Mesa burial site until 2005, given its close proximity to his trailer. Now, perhaps he had switched dumping locations due to the rapidly approaching housing developments in the surrounding area, including the one that was eventually going to take over this particular spot of land. Now, because of Lorenzo being killed in 2006, it leaves investigators with very little to go off of. Former police chief of the Albuquerque Police Department, Michael Geyer, said in an interview in 2018, "We would have liked Mr. Montoya to be our main suspect and close the case out. But with him being deceased, it limited our investigative capabilities." And then he continued and said, "The similarities were there." Now, there are a few more candidates that have been investigated, one being a pimp named Fred Reynolds, who had some contact with one of the victims, but he died in 2009, and no evidence has linked him to the case that I could find. Another candidate that was named was photographer and businessman Ron Irwin. Now, originally from Missouri, Ron visited New Mexico frequently to attend the New Mexico State Fair, and he actually had his property raided in 2010 in connection to the crimes, and numerous photographs and belongings were seized. However, Ron was later cleared from the investigation. Now, another interesting angle to propose here is the possible police involvement. Investigator Ida Lopez, who is currently leading the investigation, proposed a task force to get involved with searching for the increase of missing sex workers before the bodies were even found in West Mesa. But this was turned down, even from the Albuquerque Police Department Sex Crimes Division. Obviously, this can kind of be traced back to the idea that these missing women were sex workers and drug addicts, so the desire to find them was not very high within the department's priority list. Initially, Ida had made a list of these missing sex workers, and it turns out when the mass grave at West Mesa was discovered, 10 of the bodies in the mass grave were on Ida's list. Now, it is uncertain whether or not this alludes to the fact that perhaps the police department didn't want to investigate, or perhaps they were trying to cover something up. That kind of remains unknown. However, Cinnamon Elks, one of the victims of the bone collector, reportedly told a friend before her disappearing in August of 2004 that a dirty cop was going around chopping the heads off prostitutes and burying them in West Mesa. Now, it is uncertain whether or not any of the bodies found in West Mesa were decapitated, and that information has not been publicly released. However, the Albuquerque Police Department has had a slew of accusations and incidences related to excessive use in force and multiple incidences in between 2004 and 2013 of police officers forcing themselves onto sex workers. Now, a lot of this information was found after being investigated by the Department of Justice. Now, it is reasonable to assume that massive policy and policing changes have been made to the Albuquerque Police Department in the years following. However, it does not justify those actions that took place before that. And it kind of calls into question this whole investigative process into the West Mesa bone collector and how seriously they were taking the case and whether or not there could have been some cover-up going on. Now, there are still numerous missing sex workers from the streets of Albuquerque that have gone missing in between 2001 to 2006. And it is unclear whether or not this was the work of one person or a group of them. But it does seem that if the killer is still roaming free, he has clearly moved to a different area. Perhaps there are still bodies buried in the Albuquerque area that have yet to be discovered, and it offers a grim reality to the victims' families who might still be hanging on to a little thread of hope that some sort of justice will be found for those who were found in the mass grave in West Mesa. With that all being said, my personal thoughts on this are twofold. As much as I think corruption played a role in the investigation, and the authorities' basically lack of taking the case seriously, that kind of made it everything much harder to discover the identity of the killer and identify possible suspects. I also find it very hard-pressed that a police officer would kill 11 sex workers and dump their bodies in the West Mesa area without somebody knowing that they were doing this or coming forward. To me, it makes sense that someone like Lorenzo Montoya was committing the crimes, and with the political landscape of the time around law enforcement and sex workers, this ultimately worked to his benefit. I'm convinced that with Montoya dying in 2006, and the missing women seemingly stopping, that he is the most likely candidate for the West Mesa bone collector. However, let me know your own personal opinions on this matter in the comments section or any way and get in touch with me. Let me know. Let me know your own personal thoughts and theories. Now, Montoya was probably smart enough to realize that the police department wasn't going to chase this case or take it seriously because of the victims he was targeting. And perhaps if it wasn't for the flooding or the curious nose of Ruka the dog, those bodies would still remain undiscovered. Now, of course, again, let me know your thoughts on the case. Do you think that this was a form of cover-up? Do you think that the police department knows some things to this day that they're still not telling? However, with the whole Department of Justice investigation, in my opinion, I think the roots of the corruption are hopefully gone from the Albuquerque Police Department. And I hope that currently, Ida Lopez, who is the lead investigator on this case now, has put a new sense of direction on the case and dedication in trying to figure out who the West Mesa bone collector was. Although, my personal opinion, I still think it was Lorenzo Montoya. The timelines fit. However, it's still very possible that the killer or killers possibly moved to a different area after maybe the discovery of the bodies, or maybe in 2006 they moved to a different location. I know the police kind of backtracked in different times here and said, okay, we're not sure if this is a serial killer. These could just be basically sex worker related crimes, like the sex workers were getting killed off by their pimps or something like that, and that was what's happening. I think this genuinely was a serial killer. I don't think that that's the case whatsoever, and I think, again, that was an excuse used by the police department to possibly not take this case more seriously than it actually was. However, with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode on the West Mesa Bone Collector. Again, let me know your thoughts. Let me know your theories on this, whether that be in the comment section on YouTube, whether that be over Instagram direct message. Let me know. I'm more than open to suggestions, and if you happen to find any research that I didn't, please forward that over to me and let me know. Obviously, I am not perfect when it comes to research, so if you found something that I happened to forget or miss, please send that over to me. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'd greatly appreciate the facts that I might have missed. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you next week, and I will see you on the very next one. But before that, obligatory plug time, because I almost forgot when I was recording this and doing my closeout statement there, that if you were listening to this on Spotify, please turn on notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And if you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. And just so everybody's aware, you can go to my Instagram, Unblurring the Unknown, where I will post the custom cover art to this week's episode, as well as any photographs I found relevant to this week's episode. In addition to that, I am also on TikTok, that is also Unblurring the Unknown, where I will be posting kind of brief 1-minute breakdowns on the episodes I cover, just trying to extend the broader reach of my audience. But with that being said, this is going to be the actual conclusion of this week's episode, and I will see you all on the next one.